Okay. All right. Okay, thank you so much, Bob. And thanks to everyone who just wanted to extend my welcome to all of the people who are here. Thanks to my colleagues, Ingun and Bob, who have been so important in terms of developing this dialogue. My goal for this short introduction to the dialogue is to give people a sense of what we've been doing in Module M, and so how this particular work, especially on risk and hazards, occupational health and safety and aquaculture, where that fits in to our broader project, and then to talk a little bit about risk. And again, this will be a fairly short presentation before we move on to do a deep dive into what Ingun will be talking about, which is her hands-on research on occupational health and safety in Norway. Okay, so a brief background to Module M. As Barb said, it's part of the Ocean Frontier Institute, which was a very large project with many working parts, one of which was ours, social science project focused on social license and planning for coastal communities. That was the title. That is the title of the module. Our website is coastalfutures.ca. As Bob mentioned, it's a Memorial Dalhousie collaboration. Within our project, we have 5 submodules, 80 plus faculty, postdoctoral fellows, graduate students, and so on. And our key focus was on social license and social acceptability. One of the submodules was on occupational health and safety. So we have a bunch of submodules, each of which focuses on one or more aspects of social license in marine finfish aquaculture. And so the next slide just shows you how this particular focus on on occupational health and safety fits into our broader project. So we were interested, when we wrote the proposal, to think about social license as a concept. At the time, social license was well developed in mining and energy, not explored to any great degree in aquaculture. And so what our contribution initially was to attempt to set a research agenda. And so this paper here that was published in Marine Policy attempted to sort of say, okay, so we need to think about social license in aquaculture. What we've done since then is published a whole bunch of papers and done a whole bunch of research and reports and secured additional funding and so on around social license. But I've highlighted this particular paper that Barb Neese and her colleagues wrote in aquaculture because it gives you a sense of what we've done with social license is to, on the one hand, deepen our understanding of social license, but also extend and expand the scope of what social license is or should be for finfish aquaculture. So that's the kind of goal of this research. And I think what we've done, especially, or what Barb and her colleagues have done, especially around occupational health and safety, is really to set the agenda, to put it into the discussion around aquaculture policy. So I think that's been an important development and an important outcome of our research. Okay, so that gives you a sense of where this particular dialogue and where, in particular, Barb and Ingun's and all of the kind of collaborative work around occupational health and safety fits in. And what I'm going to do briefly now is to think about risk. So it's setting myself a pretty big task, which is try to answer the question, what is risk, in about 10 minutes. And so this is not an insubstantial task, but my goals are actually fairly modest. And so the idea with this presentation is that before we dive into the various risks facing marine aquaculture, which we will be discussing in great detail through the dialogue, and how we should be responding them, that we should maybe pause to think a little bit about what risk means more generally. And part of that, and part of the reason we might want to do this, is to recognize the complexity of risk as an idea and concept, and the complexity of risk as a set of responses before we move on to the various dimensions of risk associated with this form of animal production. So this is by way of saying, let's think a little bit about risks and hazards before we go into the details of risk assessment and response. So the ideas that I'm going to share come from work that I've been doing on mass mortalities in salmon aquaculture with Gerald Singh and Zamad Sajid. Gerald will be presenting later on in the dialogue, in fact, in the February session. And in this work, we're interested in thinking about how we might understand mass mortalities as a growing risk facing the sector. We're also interested in understanding these as particular types of disasters, low probability but very high impact events on production. And so our work led us to scholarship on risk and disasters, and I'll be outlining some of the main themes in this work. So these themes are not related to aquaculture specifically, but one of the things we might think about as we work through the dialogue is to explore the extent to which they are relevant to this sector and the risks that it faces. Okay, so I'm going to consider 3 points about risk more broadly. The first is that while people have long faced risks in their daily lives, there's broad agreement that the risks we face now are somehow different than they were before. And we've also become much more aware of risk as a thing in our lives. So just to give you a very simple example, when I started working at a university, at university, the administrative structures included department heads, deans of faculties, and vice chancellors as heads of the institution. But now all universities have a risk office. At Memorial, we have the office of the Chief Risk Officer, and one of its key goals is to oversee enterprise risk management. So this unit's function is to prepare the institution for the wide range of risks that universities face now, including being hacked, which actually happened to one of our units earlier this year. So I'm sure you all have similar experiences, through your working lives of seeing risk and more in the work that you do. So risk seems to be everywhere these days. The second point I want to make comes from research on risks, hazards, and disasters, and maybe picked up a little bit in Ingun's presentation based on the PowerPoint that she shared. And that suggests that risks may be increasingly manufactured than simply out there. So the second point tells us that we need to pay attention to the role that we play in generating the risks and hazards that we face. And then finally, a somewhat more obvious point, that risks are not felt equally across sectors or within sectors, but impact sectors and groups disproportionately. In other words, risks and hazards impact places, industries, and different groups of people differently. And being aware of this is an important part of understanding, assessing, and responding to risk. So in this sense, it takes us to the idea of vulnerability. So we need to be aware of how not everyone is equally vulnerable to risks. Okay, so my aim is not to raise these points to structure the discussion, but instead to raise them and to keep them in mind as we proceed through the dialogue session. Do these ideas resonate? Do they apply to aquaculture? And if so, how? Okay, so to start with the first point about risk is not new. So it goes without saying that people have always faced risks associated with hunger, war, natural disasters, disease, and so on. So to say that risk is something that's new to modern society isn't quite right. At the same time, it does seem to make sense to recognize that the risks that we face today are different than they were before. How are they different? Well, first, they're different because the scale of the threats are unprecedented. Threats we face aren't delimited spatially, temporally, or even socially. So in the past, we might have been worried about personal risks that we face. But right now, the risks we face seem to be of greater magnitude and are more widespread than they were before. Contemporary risks are also seen as being more open-ended in that it is difficult to imagine how they will be resolved or end. So climate change is the obvious one. A Donald Trump presidency is another. He may win the election this year in one country, but the entire planet seems to see this as a massive risk to global democracy. The second point is that it seems increasingly difficult to calculate, quantify, or assess risks accurately. And part of the challenge that Ingunn and her colleagues in particular are doing in Norway is to address this particular problem. And part of the problem is that they are non-localized and they extend over wide spaces like climate change. But it is also because the risks may have long-term consequences. And the risks that we face are multiple and new. So just to draw on Ingunn and Trine's work again, through their work, they've focused on risk in marine aquaculture, and their research gives us insights into the complexity of the risks facing the sector. They range from fish welfare and food safety, to escape prevention, to vessel design, changing local and regional environments, and so on. So the third point that I want to make is that many of the risks that we face are human-induced. In other words, it makes little sense to talk about risk as external factors that face producers of any kind. In some cases, when disaster strikes, it's seen as nature striking back against systems that are risky and vulnerable. And I'll have more to say about this in a minute, but for now, it goes without saying that the risks are not acts of God or nature gone wrong. Okay, so those are some preliminary points about how risk is different now and how increasingly we're mobilizing infrastructures and systems to try and manage and contain risks. And we'll hear from experts, obviously, in Norway and Canada, as I've mentioned on a number of occasions. Okay, so the second point I want to make is the idea that risks may be manufactured or even engineered. So this isn't an idea that builds on the point that risks and hazards we face are not just out there, but they are instead of our own making. Climate change is the obvious risk that we all face that is unquestionably human-induced. But there's more to this point about manufactured risk than simply we are responsible for generating some of the most critical risks that we face. So a few small additional points. The first is the argument that risks are manufactured or engineered by systems that are not risk averse, but instead push environmental systems to states of higher risk. In other words, we are developing production systems that are increasingly vulnerable to risks and hazards. And the one example that's used often as a case is the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. So this was one of a new generation of oil wells that are deeper and riskier than the existing wells that circle the Gulf and have been producing oil for many decades. This pushing of the envelope in oil production is driven by corporate competition, a lack of government oversight, and changes in oil markets. So, and again, this tells us that we need to understand how risks may themselves be engineered. One of the things that allows these risks to become riskier, these systems to become riskier, is ironically that we know more about them and we have better risk infrastructures. So there's a paradox. As we learn more and more about the systems within which we operate, we tend to be riskier rather than risk averse. So this challenges what might be a conventional understanding of the relationship between knowledge and risk. Rather than risk decreasing with more and greater knowledge, risks have in fact increased. Another counterintuitive is that the number of expert-led institutions charged with protecting the public from disasters has increased. The scale of risk-taking has expanded. In other words, in their work towards ending disasters, the experts have supplied much of the confidence necessary to take bigger risks. So these findings, again, come from detailed analyses of risks and disasters across many sectors. The final point I want to make here is in a sense a contradiction of a point I made earlier. We seem to recognize that risks and hazards are of our own making, but that hasn't stopped us from framing out some of the social causes of risk, which is especially a problem with climate-related risks. So what we see happening is that risks are being blamed on climate, but simultaneously all of the other social and economic issues that led to the risk or hazard being realized are set aside. So climate-induced risks and disasters end up being blamed on climate when the causes are decidedly more complex. And this detracts attention away from how risks and hazards may be engineered or manufactured. A good example, and I'm not sure whether people have been following this, but a good example is the problem facing the Panama Canal right now. There isn't enough water to allow ships to pass through the canal. So the problem is blamed on climate change, which is in part true, but the bigger picture is that climate-induced droughts is only a proximate cause of the much more complicated problem around water management in Panama, and not just the problem of drought. Okay, so the third and final point I want to make is about risk and vulnerability and how it is important to differentiate the risks across and within sectors. One of the points we will hear through the dialogue is how, from an occupational health and safety point of view, marine aquaculture is a high-risk sector. These conclusions come from analyses in Norway, Canada, and Chile, and all point to the need to consider the risks that this sector faces compared to others. Researchers who study risks and hazards have spent a long time thinking through risks and hazards and how different groups are more or less vulnerable to risk events. The consistent conclusion across these studies is that those worst affected by risks and disasters were far more vulnerable to those risks in the first place. And when disasters happen, its impact is very different across social groups. Okay, so that's the kind of final point I want to make, is to understand the kind of the disproportional effect that risks and hazards might have on people. Okay, so as you can tell, this was really a bird's eye view of risks and hazards. And now I'm delighted to turn the floor over to Ingunn Holmen, who will now get us into a more detailed analysis of risk and hazard in marine aquaculture, drawing from her and her colleagues' extraordinary work in Norway's salmon sector. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Charlie. See, I'll also share my presentation.
You want Gannon for supper or something else?
There, I think. Now you can see my slides, I hope. Yes, thank you. I will now present research findings on regulatory framework conditions and risk management practices in the Norwegian fish farming industry. The scope of our research, sorry.
Something else.
I need to, okay, there, I think we had another chat on the line. Yeah. The scope for our research has mainly been the operational grow-out phase of sea-based fish farming in Norway. And the main part of the research, which I will present today, has been conducted within SFI Exposed, which was a center for research-based innovation on exposed aquaculture operations in Norway. So first, a little bit about aquaculture in Norway. As you can see, Norway up here, north in Europe. Our Directorate of Fisheries, they provide a map, an interactive map at their website, where you can see all the locations in Norway where it is allowed to do aquaculture. So on this scale, all the red dots, they are aquaculture locations. But if we look into this in more detail, like this blue area here approximately, it will look like this. And then you can see what kind of aquaculture which is allowed on the different sides. As you can see, the blue here are shells, and the red ones here are the salmon. So the development of salmon fish farming, especially in Norway, has been profitable, but not free of safety challenges for both fish, workers, and environment. Some key numbers about Norwegian fish farming, or actually aquaculture. This figure on the right, it's also from the Norwegian Fisheries Directorate. It shows how many employees from 2012 to 2022 that has been employed by Norwegian aquaculture companies. And the dark blue line up here is salmon and rainbow trout and trout. So that is finfish farming. And in 2022, you can see that approximately 9 out of 10,000 employees altogether were actually employed within fish farming. And the production was 1.6 million metric tons. And of this, 99% and even more, very close to 100 actually, were then salmon and trout. So this is all been carried out by 163 fish farming companies at approximately 990 sites in seawater. So also a little bit about the technology. The dominating fish farm concept is open, floating, and flexible net cages, as you can see in this photo. The normal production cycle for salmon is about 18 months in sea. And each cage, as you can see in the picture here, it's of these circles, holds up to 200,000 salmon. That is the upper limit of what is allowed per cage in Norway. Workboats are used for daily maintenance and farming operations, and larger service vessels are hired for more complex operations requiring specialized equipment and competence. And wellboats are used for fish treatments, as well as transporting fish to the slaughterhouses and processing plants on shore. And larger cargo vessels supply the fish farms with fish feed. So, and actually the aquaculture fleet is then actually an important part of the fish farming industry in Norway. In Norway, as in other countries, there is political desire to increase the value creation based on the aquaculture sector. But further growth, of course, requires that we handle these risks and the safety challenges that is related to fish farming. And the fish farming industry in Norway experiences a reputation problem, which is a paradox, since it actually contributes significantly to the national value creation. So further growth of the produced biomass in Norwegian fish farming is at present coupled to the combat of the parasite called the salmon lice through the so-called traffic light system. And this was introduced by the Norwegian government in 2017. So based on reports from each fish farm, the authorities monitor average louse levels in 13 geographical production regions for salmon and trout farming. So each year, our Directorate of Fisheries will then decide if growth in production will be allowed or not, based on these salmon lice numbers. Preventing fish escape is also paramount at the fish farms, and workers may challenge their own safety to prevent escapes. Interviews with workers has clearly shown that. And the reputation of the industry is challenged by salmon escape incidents from net pens and the diseases they might carry to threat the wild salmon stocks. So since regulatory requirements instruct companies to manage lice levels and to implement measures to reduce risk of fish escapes, the workers and operational managers at Norwegian fish farms might experience conflicting objectives regarding their own health and safety. This was illustrated in a questionnaire study, which we did in 2016 and which was repeated last year. The fish farmers, they say that they prioritize occupational safety, but this is not always true. The responses to the follow-up question, in practice, the production is prioritized at the expense of safety, is that almost a quarter of the fish farmers agree to this statement, and a third of the service vessel crews. And in last year's questionnaire or survey, these numbers were still at least this level. So it's relevant to add that the workers are loyal employees and want to do a good job. And this means to take a good care of the fish and prevent anything that will harm the reputation of the industry. So this, of course, has consequences for the occupational safety levels. In our research, we have started to look at that 5 different risk dimensions as illustrated in this figure. And fish farms in Norway, they are located at sea and are exposed to all kinds of weather, such as exposure to both wind, waves, and currents. And I contributed in a study which was published in 2020 together with Young and Utne, and we defined then these 5 dimensions of risks, which is risk to material assets, personal, fish welfare and health, environment, and food safety. And fish welfare and health must be maintained, and safety hazards for fish are escapes, parasites, or the salmon louse, and infections and mortality due to handling and treatments, or even also environmental threats as algae or too high sea temperatures, as we also has experienced. Workers are doing their job on a moving platform and in close contact with high energies. And in Norway, this industry is the second most risk-exposed occupation after the fisheries, according to the rate of occupational injuries and fatalities. The external environment must be protected from pollutions or threats to wild salmon due to fish escapes. And food safety, of course, is important to safeguard and may be challenged by chemical treatments and infections. Strict routines are followed to prevent residues. Material assets might be damaged by accidents, wear and tear, or gales, which we see from perhaps a more harsh climate. And extreme weather conditions may be or has been documented to cause structural breakdowns. Okay, now over to the regulatory framework for Norwegian fish farming. This is an overview of the framework, and there are 7 regulatory areas, this inner boxes here, applicable for the grow out phase. All Norwegian companies, including the aquaculture vessels, are required to implement safety management systems. Risk assessments are mandatory, and they shall cover the areas shown in the figure. 5 Norwegian authorities have jurisdiction within these areas. This is the green boxes here on the outside. And the requirements for risk assessments in Norwegian fish farming are found in several regulatory documents. Thus, the regulations are quite fragmented in this matter. So you can see here the 4 core laws regulating the operations. And then we have a number of regulations anchored within these laws. In Norway, we have these internal control regulations, which describe the framework for the safety management system required for health, safety, and environment, as well as to comply with the aquaculture legislation. And the latter applies for prevention of fish escape. And here again, you can see then the core acts and regulations listed. So over to safety management in Norwegian fish farming. Safety performance can be evaluated through measurement of safety barrier quality, safety evaluation programs, or in terms of losses. And this table summarizes the current methods used for follow-up by the regulatory authorities and third parties, and also safety management in companies and at each fish farm. Investigations of accidents, analysis of accident registrations, and reporting of non-conformities may be a basis for identification of safety critical conditions and factors. And risk assessment is a tool to identify hazards associated with, for instance, an operation, a piece of equipment, or a workplace. Knowledge from analysis of accidents and near misses is valuable input to the risk assessments. Furthermore, inspections and safety audits are performed to check the compliance of the safety procedures and measures, for instance, the success of safety management implementation. So there are a few parameters used to systematically measure the safety performance level. The most common ones are escape of fish, which has to be reported. Every escape, even upon suspicion, has to be reported to the Norwegian Directorate of Fisheries. Lice counts are reported and also monitored. And of course, the water quality and oxygen levels to keep the fish safe. Occupational accidents are also reported. And in Norway, it's 2 regulatory authorities that receives such reports. It's for the workers at the fish farms, it's the Norwegian Labour Inspection Authority. And for the vessel crews, it's the Norwegian Maritime Authority. And when it comes to insurance claims, this is handled by the Labour and Welfare Administration. And in addition, I should also mention company internal measures connected to the safety management systems. They have a requirement to implement non-conformity reporting and handling. They also keep a record of operating reports. They might also have internal parameters like the days they do not have any accidents or incidents, the number of cleaner fish survival, and so on. And of course, other measures would be the weather forecast, measurements of currents, waves, vessel movements, and so on. Yes, and of course, we also like to add that we do research projects, surveys, and interviews, which also provide important information about occupational health and safety within this sector. Through our research, we have come up with some recommendations for how to perform risk assessments at each fish farm or within each company. Risk assessment is, as I mentioned, mandatory to perform for several risk dimensions at fish farms, and may lay the basis for systematic actions to improve safety management. We think that risk assessment should ideally be performed within or with the operation as the starting point, including all relevant risk elements. This will provide an overview of all the hazards associated with the work tasks and factors influencing the risk levels. And learning points from accident investigation is also valuable input to risk assessment. Companies should develop risk assessment templates for their yearly updates to be adapted to each vessel or fish farm. However, the template should be based on a strong involvement of workers in accordance with the previous recommendations. We have also looked into how practice could be improved on an operational level. Because we believe that the recommended procedure for improved risk assessment may also contribute to establish well-proven, quality-assured procedures at the fish farms. And when these are established and validated, preferably as a result of workshops with experienced operators, standardized procedures may be used for training and decision support for less experienced personnel. The workers at the fish farms and on the service vessels perform a range of manual tasks and make decisions which influence the success of operation, both in terms of getting the job done successfully and occupational safety. The humans are the hub of the fish farm operation system, but also perceived as the weak link of the same. The organizational and human factors influencing safety in operations, in particular user-friendly and safe design, work environment, communication, competence, and communication, should be considered in revising and improving both routine and specialized work operations, as well as work schedules to reduce work pressure and increase involvement in safety-related decisions. There are also improvements which can be made on a regulatory level. First, we think that a less fragmented set of regulations are needed. Operational managers, which we have interviewed, find it challenging to answer to several authorities, which may have different preferences in how the risk documentation should be presented. So this fragmentation in the authorities' regulations and inspection routines may result in equally fragmented risk management systems. Today, the authorities do not, as a basic rule, coordinate their inspections at the fish farms. An exception is the Directorate of Fishery and Food Safety Authority, which share the responsibility for one specific regulation regarding fish welfare. This would, of course, take a lot of effort, and the culture is also different within the different governmental institutions. However, there are an ongoing work to improve this situation. The authorities may also play a role in sharing best practices, both for overall risk management systems as well as operational practices. The Directorate of Fisheries has a focus on measures to prevent fish escape and publish analysis of registered escapes and recommendations for fish farm operations. The Labour Inspection Authority has increased their attention to the fish farming industry, aiming to reduce the number of occupational accidents. And last year, the Directorate of Fisheries launched an initiative to develop a guide for a more holistic risk management in the aquaculture industry. The main concern of this authority is to prevent fish escape and ensure fish welfare. However, it is expected that improvements in one risk dimension will have positive influence on the other dimensions, such as occupational health and safety. So with this, I conclude my presentation, and thank you for listening.
Thanks very much, Ingunn. Andrew, are you ready to go?
Apologies for being somewhat late. Yes, I'm ready to go. It's a welcome dialogue between two major aquaculture countries and two really significant aquaculture occupational safety and health groups. I think it's valuable for those participants, but also for others well beyond Canada and Norway who deal with Norwegian fish farming companies. For example, one Norwegian fish farm company, Mowi, has 53 sea fish farms and 22 freshwater fish farms in Chile. And the Norwegian companies produce the bulk of farm fish in Scotland. So there are some issues about what translates, how the systems work, that I think is probably quite central to the discussion that will occur between Norway and Canada. And these things have relevance globally. As the dialogue continues between Canada and Norway, it'll be important too, I think, from a cultural point of view, to establish that key concepts, terms, and indeed even words are the same in both countries. For example, what do we mean by safety in safety management? And exactly what are accidents, what are injuries, and where do occupational diseases fit into all of this with regard to the health and safety setting? So in terms of the two contributions, firstly, Charlie set the scene nicely for the whole dialogue on risk, issues around social license that I think we'll probably come back to later on. And that, of course, has great relevance to the sort of contribution that we've heard from Ingunn. And it will apply very much to the other three sessions. It raises important and complex questions about hazard identification on the health and safety front, as well as risk definitions and the responses that flow from that first step of hazard identification. The contextual issues then that people like Harry Ottaway first addressed become significant. That's regarding the social construction of both knowledge and ignorance when dealing with hazards. This was well before Ulrich Beck explored the Risk Society, by the way, and it's where the manufacture or the engineering of risks that Charlie mentioned are so important. Of relevance too are theories relating to the formation and operation of what's been termed social superstructures in workplaces and indeed in the wider society. and of how and to what extent, if at all, precautionary preventative principles may be adopted and applied to aquaculture health and safety. This relates to the point about risks being differentially experienced and the whole question of who creates the risk, who runs the risks, who assesses them, and who controls them, that Ingun goes on to discuss in detail. In this context, Charlie's point about risk infrastructures, pushing risk boundaries, and who does the pushing and for what reasons is really critical to policy and practice developments, both in Canada and Norway, and indeed well beyond. So Ingun then has provided us with an important, in-depth, evidence-based analysis of aspects of regulation and the implementation of safety management and risk assessment in Norwegian fish companies. SINTEF has been a major source of so much research on aquaculture health and safety for several years, and I think leads the way in assessing fish farm health and safety globally. Clearly, it's got a very large aquaculture workforce within its own borders. For example, it's 4 times the size of the Scottish fish farming workforce, and the scale of the enterprises and the sort of structures that exist there, I think must explain some of the impacts that Norway has had, very positive impacts. But there's still plenty of questions to ask, I think. The challenges that the expansion of Norwegian fish farming will bring, and the tensions and the possible conflicts that may emerge, are described in various places by Ingun in her presentation. Several of these challenges with aquaculture occupational safety and health dimensions are and will occur in other countries, including Canada, clearly. They've led to doubts being raised in some places with regard to the future of luxury salmon production and the threats to wild salmon that Ingun mentioned, the growing sea lice problem and fish welfare. And that's where I think social license is really going to be, and already is, a major debate. A key issue to explore in a Canadian context then, based on what Ingun has been saying, is the Norwegian view amongst owners, managers and workers, the majority view, that there is no serious conflict between production and safety in the industry. Is this due to good regulation? Is it due to investment? Is it due to better staffing levels? Is it due to having manageable work pressures or effective engagement of workers in addressing health and safety issues? Or is it a combination of all of these things? And again, it's something to look at and to wonder to what extent one can transfer and translate those approaches. Ingun does flag the questions around the need to reduce work pressures and to increase further involvement in safety decisions. She also raises some questions about what might possibly be insurance pressures on risk assessments and industrial injuries and diseases. How effective will in-house measures be? How can procedures be fully standardized? And will a holistic, coordinated regulatory visit program possibly dilute oversight, lack focus or detail, or will it in fact continue to work well and reduce injuries and diseases in the sector? Again, big questions about how these things operate in practice, how they fit together. We could add, will consumers be able to press effectively for better occupational health and safety in the fish farming industry too? So in a European setting, there's a view that Norwegian occupational health and safety generally, not just fish farming, is better than many other countries. We've certainly seen this in offshore oil and gas because of its social values and social cohesion and structures that allow worker involvement in health and safety decision-making. Does Canada have a similar approach to Norway? And does it use the same regulatory and risk assessment tools as effectively? And if it doesn't, will it want to adopt them in a similar way to Norway or not? Finally, can or should health and safety principles, structures and relevant templates be transposed between countries? Or would Charlie's point about there being different risks in different circumstances across and within sectors and risk infrastructures come into play? So it strikes me we're off to an excellent start. I'm sure everybody has much to discuss with regard to what Charlie and Ingen have said. Barb, I don't know if you're going over to your stakeholder comments first. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. Okay, so yes, we're going to go now to Daryl, but I'm just going to turn off the recording at this point. And then